The courtroom was a silent, marble mausoleum, a place where the final, cold rites of justice were about to be administered. At the defendant's table sat Isabella Rossi, a woman whose beauty was so striking, so cinematic, that it seemed to mock the grim reality of her surroundings. For weeks, she had played the part of the grieving widow to perfection, her tearful, impassioned testimony a masterclass in manipulative theater. But the final act had been played, the last lie had been told, and now all that was left was the unblinking, merciless gaze of the law. Judge Marcus Thorne looked down from the bench, his expression not one of anger, but of a deep, almost surgical disgust. He was a man who had seen every form of human depravity, but the woman before him represented a special kind of evil, a predator who had weaponized the most sacred of human emotions. Love. Mrs. Rossi, he began, his voice a low, cold instrument of judgment. You have sat in this courtroom and performed a symphony of counterfeit grief. You have wept, you have begged, you have invoked the name of the man you murdered as if you were his most devoted mourner. But this court is not your audience, and this is not a stage for your tragic plays. He paused, letting the weight of his words press down on her. You took the life of a good and trusting man, a man who, in the winter of his life, believed he had found a final, joyful spring in you. You used his love as a tool, his trust as a key, and his home as a slaughterhouse. You are a parasite who cloaked yourself in the sacred vows of marriage to feed on a fortune you did not earn and a life you did not value. Therefore, he said, his voice dropping to a final, irrevocable decree, it is the sentence of this court that you shall be committed to the state penitentiary for the term of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. You may have fooled Richard Sterling, but you will not fool this court. The performance is over. But how does a woman so beautiful, so beloved, become a monster so cold? The story begins, as it so often does, not with a gunshot or a struggle, but with a simple, tragic fall in the deceptive quiet of a perfect, opulent home. The 911 call came just after midnight. The voice on the line was a masterpiece of controlled hysteria, a woman gasping for breath between gut-wrenching sobs. It was Isabella Rossi. She screamed that she had just found her husband, 65-year-old Richard Sterling, lying at the bottom of the grand, sweeping staircase that was the centerpiece of their palatial estate. He fell, she cried. Oh God, I think he's dead. Please hurry. When paramedics and police arrived at the Sterling mansion, they found a scene of quiet, domestic tragedy. Richard Sterling, a titan of industry and one of the city's most respected philanthropists, was dead, his neck broken in a manner consistent with a catastrophic fall. At the top of the marble staircase, a single, overturned glass of whiskey and a scattered deck of playing cards suggested a simple, tragic misstep in the dark. Isabella, his beautiful 32-year-old wife, was inconsolable. She was a picture of absolute devastation, wrapped in a silk robe, her face a mask of raw, unfiltered grief. She clung to the responding officers, her body shaking, as she recounted finding him. The initial report was clear. A terrible, heartbreaking accident. A wealthy, older man, perhaps a bit unsteady on his feet after a nightcap, had taken a fatal tumble in his own home. It was a tragedy, but it was not a crime. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to Case X and like this video. Your support is what allows us to bring these in-depth investigations to you. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get back to the story. Richard Sterling was a man who had built his world with his own two hands. He was not born into wealth. He had forged it from the raw materials of grit, intelligence, and an old-fashioned, unshakable integrity. A titan of the manufacturing industry, he had started with a single, small factory and had, over 40 years, built it into a global empire. He was a figure of immense respect in the city, known as much for his ruthless business acumen as for his quiet, unpublicized philanthropy. He was a man from an older, sterner generation, a man for whom a handshake was a binding contract and a person's word was their most valuable asset. But his life was also marked by a profound and private loneliness. He had lost his first wife, his college sweetheart, to a sudden illness a decade prior, and the loss had hollowed him out. His two grown children, both successful in their own right, had families of their own in distant cities. The grand, opulent mansion he had built as a monument to his success had become a quiet, echoing tomb, a place filled with the ghosts of a happier time. Friends and colleagues described him in those years as a man operating in grayscale, a brilliant mind and a good heart going through the motions of a life that had lost its color. Then, Isabella Rossi walked into his life. She was a vibrant, brilliant splash of color in his monochrome world. They met at a charity gala, where she, a young art curator with a sharp wit and a dazzling smile, had captivated him. At 32, she was 33 years his junior, a fact that raised eyebrows among the city's elite. But to Richard, the age gap was irrelevant. He was not a fool blinded by beauty. He was a lonely man who had found a companion who was his intellectual equal, a woman who seemed to genuinely delight in his stories, his experience, and his company. For the first time in a decade, Richard Sterling was happy. The laughter returned to the silent halls of his mansion. He traveled, he entertained, he seemed to shed 20 years from his age. To his friends, it was a miracle. He doted on Isabella, showering her with gifts, but more importantly, with a deep and profound trust. He saw her not as a trophy, but as a partner, the woman with whom he would spend the winter of his life. He was a man who had spent his career analyzing risk, assessing threats, and outmaneuvering his competitors. He believed he could read people, that he could see the hidden agendas and the subtle tells. But in Isabella, he saw only what he wanted to see. A second chance at love, a final, joyful chapter in a long and storied life. He was so captivated by the beautiful, perfect facade she had constructed for him that he never, for 1 second, saw the cold, reptilian predator lurking just behind her loving, adoring eyes. His greatest strength, his unwavering belief in the integrity of a person's word, had become his greatest and most fatal vulnerability. Isabella Rossi's performance in the hours and days following her husband's death was a masterpiece of emotional theater. She did not just act grieving. She became the very embodiment of tragic, heartbreaking loss. She was so convincing that she transformed the initial police officers and paramedics from objective first responders into a protective circle of unwitting sympathizers. Her 911 call had been the opening act, a flawless symphony of panic and despair. When officers arrived, they found her collapsed at the bottom of the grand staircase, her arms wrapped around her husband's body, her face buried in his chest, her silk robe stained with his blood. Her cries were not the loud, theatrical wails of a performer, but the low, guttural, soul-crushing sobs of a woman whose world had just been obliterated. It was a performance of such raw, visceral power that no one in the room could have conceived it was a lie. She was so hysterical that she was unable to give a coherent statement at the scene. Paramedics, concerned for her state of shock, sedated her lightly and transported her to the hospital for observation, a move that bought her precious time and further cemented her status as a victim. Her initial story was pieced together through the brief, frantic sentences she had gasped to the 911 operator and the first officer on the scene. Her plausible lie was built on a foundation of tragic simplicity. Richard, she claimed, had been in his study, having a final glass of whiskey and playing a game of solitaire, a nightly ritual for him. She had been upstairs in their bedroom, reading. She heard a sudden, terrible crash, a sound that shook the whole house. She ran from the bedroom and saw him, a crumpled figure at the bottom of the stairs. She had screamed his name, had run to him, had tried to find a pulse, but there was nothing. It was a simple, linear, and utterly believable account of a domestic accident. In the days that followed, she played the part of the widow to perfection. Dressed in elegant black, her beautiful face pale and drawn, she received a steady stream of condolences at the mansion. She would break down in quiet, dignified sobs when friends shared a fond memory of Richard. She spoke of him in the present tense, as if unable to accept that he was gone. "Richard loves these flowers," she would whisper to a guest, her voice thick with a grief that seemed almost too profound to bear. She was so convincing that even Richard's own children, who had initially been skeptical of their father's much younger wife, were won over by the sheer, overwhelming force of her sorrow. They saw not a gold-digging stranger, but a woman who had truly loved their father, a fellow mourner lost in a fog of unimaginable pain. Isabella Rossi's mask was not just a disguise. It was a work of art. She had created a character so compelling, so tragic, and so utterly believable that she had made the entire city her audience. And as she stood at her husband's funeral, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek as she placed a white rose on his casket, no one in the world, least of all the detectives who had officially closed the case as a tragic accident, could have possibly imagined that they were watching the performance of a cold, brilliant, and unrepentant killer. For 2 weeks, the death of Richard Sterling was a closed case, a tragic but unremarkable file labeled accidental death in the county records. The city mourned its fallen titan. Isabella Rossi played the part of the grieving widow, and the machinery of a vast estate began the slow process of transferring wealth. But one person couldn't shake a feeling of profound, nagging doubt: Detective Frank Russo. Russo was the last detective to leave the Sterling mansion on the night of the death, and the pristine, almost staged perfection of the scene had bothered him. He was a man who had seen 100 accidental falls in his career, and they were always messy, chaotic events. Richard Sterling's fall was too clean. The overturned whiskey glass, the scattered playing cards. It felt less like the chaotic result of a fall and more like a set designer's idea of what a fall should look like. The first official crack in the story came from the autopsy report. The coroner had, as expected, listed the cause of death as a broken neck consistent with a fall. But a secondary finding, noted in the toxicology report, was a small but unusual dose of a powerful sedative in Richard's system. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it was more than enough to cause severe dizziness, disorientation, and unsteadiness. The family doctor confirmed that Richard had no prescription for such a drug. It was an anomaly, a quiet question mark in an otherwise open and shut case. Fueled by this inconsistency, Detective Russo began a quiet, off-the-books inquiry. He started with the one thing that always tells a story: the money. Posing as an insurance investigator following up on a routine claim, he contacted the Sterling family's estate lawyer. And it was there, in the dry, legal language of financial documents, that he found the linchpin. Richard Sterling had a massive $25 million life insurance policy. The sole beneficiary, as of his marriage 2 years prior, was Isabella Rossi. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the activity on the policy in the week leading up to Richard's death. The insurance company's records showed a series of aggressive and repeated inquiries from Isabella. On Monday, she had called to confirm the payout amount. On Tuesday, she had emailed to verify that the beneficiary designation was irrevocable. On Thursday, just 2 days before Richard's accidental fall, she had called a final time, asking for a detailed explanation of the accidental death clause and the average timeline for a payout. This was the discovery that transformed the case. This was not the behavior of a loving wife. This was the due diligence of a predator about to close a deal. A grieving widow does not check the fine print on a life insurance policy days before her husband's unexpected death. A killer does. The sedative in Richard's system was no longer a random anomaly. It was a potential tool. The accidental fall was no longer a tragedy. It was a potential murder. Detective Russo now had enough to officially reopen the case, and his investigation had a new and singular focus: the beautiful, grieving, and suddenly very suspicious widow, Isabella Rossi. With the case now an active homicide investigation, Detective Russo secured a warrant for Isabella Rossi's entire digital life. He knew that the woman who had so meticulously planned her financial windfall would have a second, hidden life where she planned to spend it. The initial search of her known devices, her designer laptop, her top-of-the-line smartphone, yielded nothing. They were as pristine and carefully curated as her public performance of grief, filled only with loving photos of Richard and communications with her high-society friends. But Russo's team knew this was just another layer of the facade. During a second, more thorough search of the Sterling mansion, they found it. Tucked away in a small, forgotten jewelry box in the back of a guest room closet was a cheap, disposable burner phone. This was Isabella's real life, a secret, digital world that ran in parallel to the one she performed for her husband. And the contents of that phone did not just suggest a motive. They screamed it. The burner phone was a direct conduit to her secret lover. He was a 28-year-old personal trainer and aspiring model named Marco, a man whose chiseled good looks were matched only by his apparent lack of a moral compass. The text message history between Isabella and Marco was a sordid, sprawling epic of lust, greed, and cold-blooded conspiracy. The messages chronicled a passionate, year-long affair. They were filled with stolen moments, secret hotel rendezvous, and increasingly bold plans for a future together. A future that was entirely and explicitly contingent on Richard Sterling's removal from the picture. "I can't stand pretending anymore," Marco had texted 3 months out. "When are we going to be together for real?" Isabella's reply was cold and practical. "Patience, my love. A man like Richard has a lot of paperwork. I'm handling it." 1 month out, Isabella sent Marco a link to a real estate listing for a $10 million beachfront villa in Dubai. "Soon," she had written, "this will be our view. No more hiding." 1 week out, the plan began to crystallize. "The sleeping pills are secured," Isabella texted. "Just a little something to make him unsteady." The house will do the rest of the work. It will be a tragedy. Everyone will feel so sorry for me. The final text, a message sent from Isabella to Marco just an hour after the police had cleared the scene and declared Richard's death an accident, was the digital nail in her coffin. Marco had texted, "Is it done?" Isabella's reply was a single, chilling, and triumphant word, "Done." The burner phone was the smoking gun. It transformed the narrative from a simple story of a gold-digging wife to a far more classic and sinister tale. A story of a murderous, adulterous couple plotting to kill a wealthy, trusting man to fund their escape into a life of consequence-free luxury. The grieving widow was a lie. The tragic accident was a lie. The only true thing in Isabella Rossi's life was her affair, a secret so dark and so powerful that she was willing to commit murder to protect it and to profit from it. The digital affair provided the salacious how, but a deeper dive into Isabella Rossi's past and her meticulous financial planning revealed the terrifying why. Marco, the handsome personal trainer, was not the love of her life. He was a co-conspirator, an accessory, and ultimately, just another disposable asset in her master plan. The true motive, the cold, black heart of the entire crime, was not lust. It was pure, unadulterated, and psychopathic greed. Detective Russo's team began a deep background check on Isabella, and that art curator persona she had so masterfully performed for Richard quickly evaporated. She was not a woman of culture and refinement. She was a career predator, a black widow who had spent her entire adult life moving from one wealthy, older man to the next. They uncovered a trail of broken engagements and short-lived relationships across the country, each one ending with Isabella walking away with a significant parting gift. A car, a piece of jewelry, a down payment on an apartment. She was a con artist of the highest order, a woman who had perfected the art of weaponizing her beauty and charm to extract wealth. Richard Sterling was not her first victim. He was just her biggest and most final score. Her internet search history, recovered from her primary laptop, confirmed this cold, financial motive. There were no searches for how to be a good wife or happy marriage tips. There were only the cold, hard queries of a corporate raider planning a hostile takeover, average net worth of manufacturing CEOs, how to get named as a sole beneficiary, legal challenges to a prenuptial agreement, and countries with no extradition treaty with the United States. And, most damningly, a series of searches for tasteless jokes and memes about gold diggers and marrying for money. She was not just a predator. She was a predator with a smug, self-aware sense of humor about her own dark work. The murder of Richard Sterling was the culmination of her life's ambition. It was the final, brutal step in a long and successful career of financial predation. The $25 million life insurance payout was not just a bonus. It was the entire point of the operation. It was to be her retirement fund, the seed capital for a new, permanent life of luxury where she would never have to work or pretend again. And what of Marco? The text messages, when read in this new context, told a different story. He was not her partner, he was her exit strategy. She had promised him a life of luxury in Dubai, but her search history showed queries for private, solo travel and how to set up anonymous, single-owner offshore accounts. The inescapable conclusion was that her plan was to use Marco for the thrill of the affair, let him serve as a potential accomplice and scapegoat if needed, and then, once the insurance money was secured, she would vanish, leaving him behind just as she had left a trail of other men in her wake. This was the horrifying, twisted why. Isabella Rossi was not a woman who killed for love. She was a woman who used the language of love as a tool to kill for money. Richard Sterling was her mark. Marco was her alibi and her entertainment. And the murder was a simple, logical, and necessary business transaction. The final, bloody masterstroke of a predator who had just closed the biggest and most profitable deal of her entire parasitic life. The trial of Isabella Rossi was the biggest high society spectacle the city had seen in decades. It was a perfect storm of wealth, sex, betrayal, and murder. The courtroom was a standing room-only theater, the gallery packed with a mix of Richard Sterling's powerful friends, a titillated public, and a horde of national media. At the center of it all was Isabella, now 33 years old, her beauty somehow amplified by the grim reality of her surroundings. She had traded her widow's black for a wardrobe of soft, cream-colored blouses and tailored pants, an image of fragile, feminine innocence. Her expression was a carefully rehearsed mask of bewildered sorrow, the look of a woman who simply could not comprehend how she had ended up in this nightmare. Her defense team, led by the city's most expensive and notoriously aggressive defense attorney, Julian Croft, built their strategy on a simple, audacious premise. Isabella was the true victim. In his opening statement, Croft painted a picture of a loving wife who was now being doubly victimized, first by the tragic, accidental death of her husband, and now by a jealous and incompetent police force that had twisted the facts to frame her. He dismissed the text messages as fantasies, the digital role-playing of a lonely woman in a May-December marriage, and he portrayed Detective Russo as a rogue cop with a vendetta. The prosecution, led by the sharp, methodical, and utterly unflappable Assistant District Attorney, Evelyn Reed, had a different strategy. She would not be drawn into a battle of charisma with the defense. She would build a cage of cold, hard, and undeniable facts around Isabella Rossi, a cage from which there would be no escape. Her opening statement began with the last photo ever taken of Richard Sterling, a smiling, vibrant man on his yacht, a picture of a life lived to the fullest. "This is the man who was stolen from us," Reed told the jury, "and the evidence will show that he was stolen by the one person he trusted to be the safe harbor in the winter of his life." The state's case was a slow, methodical demolition of Isabella's entire existence. They began with the autopsy report, the quiet but damning evidence of the sedative in Richard's system, a drug that had made his accidental fall all but inevitable. Then came the financial experts who walked the jury through Isabella's history of financial predation, the string of wealthy older men she had left in her wake, and the aggressive, repeated inquiries she had made about the $25 million life insurance policy in the days just before Richard's death. But the centerpiece of the state's case was the digital evidence. A forensics expert took the stand and, with the cold, dispassionate precision of a scientist, laid bare Isabella's secret life. The jury saw the texts from the burner phone, the passionate declarations to her lover, Marco, and the chilling, triumphant message sent just after her husband's death. Done. They saw her internet search history, the queries about countries with no extradition, the real estate listings for Dubai. With each new piece of evidence, each new text message displayed on the courtroom monitors, Isabella's mask of bewildered innocence began to show hairline cracks. The jury, which at first had seen a beautiful, tragic widow, was now beginning to see something else entirely. A cold, calculating predator who had hunted and killed her prey with a chilling and absolute lack of remorse. With the prosecution's case painting a damning picture of a cold-blooded predator, the defense made a high-stakes, theatrical gamble. They would put Isabella Rossi on the stand. It was a strategy born of arrogance, a belief that Isabella's beauty, charm, and masterful ability to perform emotion could overcome any mountain of factual evidence. It was to be her star turn, the cries in court, begging for mercy moment that her lawyers believed would save her. Isabella took the stand, her face a mask of fragile, heartbreaking sorrow. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice, her testimony a masterclass in manipulative theater. She painted a picture of a lonely young woman who had found true, unexpected love with an older man. She spoke of Richard's kindness, his wisdom, her deep and profound admiration for him. When her own lawyer, Julian Croft, gently asked her about her husband's death, she broke down in a torrent of gut-wrenching, theatrical sobs. "I heard a crash," she wept, her body shaking. "I ran out and I saw him. I saw my wonderful, beautiful husband lying there. And my world ended. It ended right there at the bottom of those stairs." This evidence, Reed continued, her voice unwavering, directly rebuts the defendant's sworn testimony regarding her emotional state and her love for her husband on the night of his death. It was recovered from a hidden, encrypted folder on the defendant's personal cell phone just this morning by our forensics team. The judge, his expression grim, overruled the objection. The courtroom held. She then addressed the affair with Marco, framing it not as a betrayal, but as a foolish, meaningless mistake. "I was lonely," she cried, dabbing her eyes with a perfectly placed tissue. "Richard worked so much. Marco was just a distraction, a fantasy. It never meant anything. Richard was the only man I ever truly loved." She was so convincing, her grief so raw and so seemingly authentic, that a palpable wave of sympathy washed over the courtroom. For a moment, it seemed her performance might actually work. She had planted a seed of doubt. Perhaps she was not a monster, but just a flawed, heartbroken woman who had made a terrible mistake. This performance of the grieving widow was her primary act of cruelty. She was not just lying. She was desecrating the memory of the man she had murdered, using a twisted, fictionalized version of his love for her as a shield. She was weaponizing his own kindness against him, one last act of parasitic exploitation. To Richard's children, sitting in the front row. This was a special kind of hell, watching their father's killer perform a one-woman play about a love that they now knew was a complete and utter fraud. It was a theater of cruelty performed with tears and a trembling voice, a final, sickening insult to the man she had so coldly and so efficiently erased. Isabella Rossi's performance on the stand was so powerful, so emotionally resonant, that for a brief moment, the momentum in the courtroom had shifted. Her lawyer, Julian Croft, could feel it. He concluded his direct examination, leaving his client's tearful, heartbreaking testimony hanging in the air. He turned to the prosecution with a confident, almost smug look. The defense rested. Their case was simple. Their client's profound and obvious grief was the only proof of innocence they needed. They had presented the jury with a living, breathing, weeping embodiment of a heartbroken widow, and they were betting everything that the jury would believe the woman over the cold, circumstantial evidence. It was a bold and brilliant strategy that, for a moment, seemed destined for success. The courtroom was still thick with the residue of Isabella's performance. The jury looked at her with a new, conflicted sympathy. Assistant District Attorney Evelyn Reed stood up for her cross-examination, but she didn't approach the witness stand. Instead, she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice a calm, steady blade cutting through the emotional haze. "The defense rests. The state would now like to present one final piece of rebuttal evidence." A wave of confusion swept through the room. The defense attorney, Croft, shot to his feet, objecting immediately. "Rebuttal for what?" The state has rested, its breath as the large monitors flickered to life. The image that appeared was shaky, filmed on a cell phone. The perspective was low, looking up slightly. It was the bottom of the grand Sterling staircase. And lying there, in the exact position the police had found him, was the still, unmoving body of Richard Sterling. Then, a voice was heard. A voice that was not filled with grief or panic, but with a cold, triumphant, and almost bored amusement. It was Isabella. The camera then flipped, and her face filled the screen. She was not crying. Her face was a mask of cold, reptilian satisfaction. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. She looked down, off-camera, at the body of the man she had just murdered. "Did you really think I loved you?" she whispered, her voice a soft, venomous taunt directed at her dead husband. The camera panned down to his body one last time, then back to her face. She looked directly into the lens, as if speaking to her future self, a co-conspirator in her own crime. "Don't worry, Richard," she said, her smile widening into a triumphant smirk. "I'll take very good care of your money." The video ended. The courtroom was not just silent. It was a vacuum. The sound of Isabella's own voice, her own triumphant, monstrous words, hung in the air like a poisonous gas. The jury stared, their faces a mixture of pure, unadulterated shock and a cold, dawning fury. They had been played. Her tears, her sobs, her heartfelt declarations of love. It was all a lie, and they had just been shown the irrefutable, behind-the-scenes proof of the real performance. Isabella Rossi sat on the witness stand, frozen. The mask of the grieving widow was gone, shattered into a million pieces. Her face was a ghastly, pale white, her eyes wide with the raw, animal terror of a predator that has just been caught in a trap of its own making. The performance was over. The monster had just been unmasked, by the one witness she could never have expected, herself. The video had been a tactical nuke, detonated in the center of the courtroom, vaporizing Isabella Rossi's entire defense and her carefully constructed persona. The jury's deliberation was a ghost of a formality. They were in the room for less than 20 minutes, a period that was less about debating guilt and more about the collective, silent shaking of heads in shared, horrified certainty. When they returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense drama to a cold, grim finality. The jury foreman, a woman who had been seen wiping away a tear during Isabella's performance, now stared at the defendant with eyes of pure, unadulterated ice. She delivered the verdict without a single tremor in her voice. Guilty. Isabella did not cry. She did not rage. The performer was gone, the mask shattered, and what was left was a hollow, empty shell. She simply stared forward, her beautiful face a blank canvas of absolute defeat, as the life she had so meticulously and so brutally plotted was legally and irrevocably extinguished. At her sentencing hearing, the final act played out. Richard Sterling's children delivered a joint victim impact statement, speaking not of their own grief, but of their father's profound and fatally misplaced trust. "Our father believed in the good in people," his daughter said, her voice a quiet testament to a lesson learned too late. "Isabella Rossi is living proof that some people have no good in them at all." When the judge asked Isabella if she had anything to say, she stood, and for a moment, it seemed she might finally offer a word, an explanation, anything. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The master manipulator, the woman who had built an empire of lies with her voice, was finally and permanently silent. Judge Marcus Thorne looked down at her, his face a mask of profound disgust, and delivered the final judgment. "Mrs. Rossi," he began, his voice a low, cold instrument of justice. "You have sat in this courtroom and performed a symphony of counterfeit grief. You have wept, you have begged, you have invoked the name of the man you murdered as if you were his most devoted mourner. But this court is not your audience, and this is not a stage for your tragic plays." He paused, letting the weight of his words press down on her. "You took the life of a good and trusting man, a man who, in the winter of his life, believed he had found a final, joyful spring in you. You used his love as a tool, his trust as a key, and his home as a slaughterhouse. You are a parasite who cloaked yourself in the sacred vows of marriage to feed on a fortune you did not earn and a life you did not value. Therefore," he said, his voice dropping to a final, irrevocable decree, "it is the sentence of this court that you shall be committed to the state penitentiary for the term of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. You may have fooled Richard Sterling, but you will not fool this court. The performance is over." Isabella Rossi was led from the courtroom, her face a blank, beautiful, and utterly empty mask. The video from her phone, which was leaked to the media, became a viral sensation, a chilling, unforgettable glimpse into the mind of a true sociopath. Her whispered words to her dead husband, "I'll take very good care of your money," became a dark, cultural touchstone, a meme, a punchline that was anything but funny. Her lover, Marco, who had testified against her in exchange for a reduced sentence on conspiracy charges, served 3 years in prison before being released and disappearing into obscurity. Richard Sterling's vast fortune, which had been the entire point of Isabella's monstrous plan, was returned to his estate and passed on to his children, who immediately established a major foundation in their father's name, dedicated to supporting victims of financial and emotional fraud. In prison, Isabella Rossi, the woman who had lived her life as a captivating performance for an audience of wealthy men, finally found herself without an audience at all. She was just another inmate, her beauty and charm rendered useless currencies in a world that valued only strength and survival. The final image of her was not one of rage or sorrow, but of a profound and chilling emptiness, a black widow caught in her own web, a master actress left to play out the final, longest, and most silent role of her life in a cage of her own making.